John Stuart Mill was a 19th century British philosopher and the most important theoretician of or advocate for the moral philosophy that's called utilitarianism. His writings on utilitarianism have been tremendously important for later thinkers in moral philosophy. Um, he's not the first person to advocate or to expound utilitarianism, but he's the most sophisticated thinker to have done so. Brief word about his life. So as I said, he's a 19th century figure, born in 1806, dies in 1873. He's British. He was, his family's originally Scottish, I believe, but he was born just north of London. And his father educated him. Now, I mention this for two reasons. One reason is that his father was famous in his own right. James Mill is one of the more important economists from the 19th century. And so had kind of established a name for himself in his own right. And James Mill himself was a somewhat prolific author, wrote a number of things on economics and so on. But the second reason I mention it is because James Mill was also a proponent of utilitarianism. He was friends with a thinker named Jeremy Bentham, who was kind of the originator of the word utilitarianism at the very least, but seems to have also been kind of the originator of the theory. Jeremy Bentham. James Mill was highly influenced by Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a couple decades older than James Mill and had a kind of fairly profound influence on James Mill. That influence manifested itself in part in James Mill's aspirations for his son, John Stuart Mill. James Mill orchestrated, carried through with this intense, rigorous education program for John Stuart Mill, for his son, with the idea being that that James Mill would help create the kind of next leading intellectual of the day who will help carry England and Britain into greater and greater happiness and prosperity. And so he designed this rigorous education program, which when you read, John Stuart Mill wrote an autobiography and he details what exactly the education program consisted in. And it's just crazy. When John Stuart Mill was 3, he started learning ancient Greek. I don't know if any of you have taken classes in ancient Greek. It's not an easy language. It's among the hardest languages to learn. When he was 8, he started learning Latin. By the time he was in his teens, he had read pretty much everything we have in ancient Greek in ancient Greek. There's a handful of people alive today who have ever done that. He did that by the time he was in his teens. He would read kind of cutting edge science experiments for fun. Rigorous education. He never, in fact, went to a university. So John Stuart Mill, he was kind of homeschooled and never went to a university and never was involved with universities. He spent his kind of career, or the majority of his career, working for the East India Company, which was if you've never heard it before, it's kind of a wild story. It's kind of a strange organization. It was basically a company that became something like the government of India. It assumed certain administrative and militaristic powers. John Stuart Mill, and so it was essentially like the government of India, even though it was a business. John Stuart Mill rose in the ranks of that company, becoming something like, something like a Secretary of State. He was a very high-ranking official within that company. that company is basically loses all its power. There's a revolt in 1858, and so he leaves. He shortly thereafter becomes elected to British Parliament, something like a senator, right? When we talk about the United States Senate, I don't know, Parliament's somewhat like that, or a representative. John Stuart Mill is elected to Parliament. He serves one term. He's not reelected. His ideas weren't particularly popular. He spent a lot of his time writing, especially in his later life. The most important, widely read works he wrote are these three: On Liberty, which is concerned with freedom of thought, freedom of speech. He outlines what's become very famous, it's called the harm principle, in On Liberty. And On Liberty is one of the most important texts for thinking through freedom of thought in particular, freedom of speech, I should say. He wrote Utilitarianism, which is what we're reading. Many people see it as the most kind of sophisticated exposition of utilitarianism that you can read. And he also wrote an important work called The Subjection of Women, in which he advocated for equal rights for women. And this is one of the unpopular things that he advocated for while he was a member of Parliament. He advocated for women to gain the right to vote. That was not popular at the time. He discusses that in The Subjection of Women. Again, not popular at the time. But those were his major works. Let's turn now very briefly to what's going on in utilitarianism, the project of this work entitled Utilitarianism. Mill starts off in chapter 1 kind of straightforward. His project, he tells us, is to determine what the fundamental principle of morality is. Now, he uses different phrases and terms to refer to this fundamental principle of morality. So he'll call it the first principle of morality. He'll call it the test or criterion of right and wrong. It's a kind of, this first principle, this fundamental principle, is going to be some sort of test where we can figure out what's right and wrong. We can test things, see if they're right and wrong. And he also refers to it as the source of moral obligation. It's this first principle is the source of morality. It's what morality boils down to. And so he's going to try to determine what this is, or if there's more than one, well, then what they are. But as becomes very clear, he thinks there's just one. Before we get to his answer or his claim as to what the first principle of morality is, I want to spend a little bit more time in chapter 1 talking about his project, because Mill discusses previous thinkers who had tried to give an account of the first principle of morality, the fundamental principle of morality. And one of the people he mentions is Immanuel Kant. So these are quotes. This is a quote from Mill. I've kind of broken it up, but we're going to run through it, see what he says about Kant. And so he's discussing how he's trying Mill is discussing how Mill is going to try to give us an account of this first principle of morality. But he says, well, look, I can't, before we go on, I can't help but refer to a systematic treatise by one of the most illustrious of these previous moral philosophers. And this treatise is The Metaphysics of Ethics by Kant. You might think, well, Metaphysics of Ethics, what on earth is that? We read this thing called The Groundwork. That just is the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Different title, right? It was originally written in German, and so there's a different title for it. But what Mill is talking about when he says The Metaphysics of Ethics by Kant is what we read, the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, right? And so, okay, Mill's going to say something about that. Because in Mill's view, Kant was trying to do what Mill is trying to do. Kant was trying to give a first principle of morality, a criterion, a test of right and wrong, right? And one of the things we looked at when we were looking at Kant was how Kant gives us a kind of test, a decision procedure. Well, that's how Mill reads them. Continuing on with Mill. This remarkable man, Kant, whose system of thought will long remain one of the landmarks in the history of philosophical speculation, which is true, it has, does, in the treatise in question, lay down a universal first principle as the origin and ground of moral obligation. It is this, right? So what Mill is saying here, Kant, in the groundwork, attempts to give us the fundamental principle of morality, the source of moral obligation, the criterion of right and wrong. And what does Kant think the fundamental principle of morality is? Mill again. So act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. Right, so that's obviously a different translation than what we read. But what Mill is citing here is the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will it become a universal law. That's what Mill's talking about. So in Mill's own view, what Kant was doing in the groundwork was attempting to give us a criterion of right and wrong, the fundamental principle of morality. And in Kant's view, the fundamental principle of morality is this formula of universal law. And it's easy to see how it's a test of right and wrong. This is something that Mill is going to stress. And this is a major difference between Mill and Kant. When we were reading Kant, before we got into the weeds, so to speak, we talked about what Kant's project was and why he was doing what he was doing, why he thought it was a worthwhile project. Kant thought that giving a rational justification for morality, as we talked about it then, he thought that that was worthwhile, not in order to figure out what was right and wrong, but in order that we might be able to strengthen our wills against our immoral inclinations, our inclinations that would have us do something immoral, right? Mill by Kant, right? Because Kant thought we all agreed, we all knew what was in fact right and wrong. In Mill, we find a difference. According to Mill, the purpose of doing moral philosophy, of figuring out what the fundamental principle of morality is, the purpose of that is to figure out what's right and wrong. There's disagreement. We don't all agree on how we should behave and how we should act and what morality requires of us. And so what we need is a criterion of right and wrong that we can then use and apply and figure out what we should do and how we should behave and how society should be structured and so on. That's Mill's idea. And that, by and large, is the idea that most moral philosophers have today. The reason we do moral philosophy is to figure out what's right and wrong. There's all kinds of disagreement. And so one difference, I think, or one thing that accounts for this difference between Mill and Kant is their slightly different contexts. There was simply more disagreement about morality in Mill's day than there was in Kant's. Kant could sit there and say, yeah, we more or less all agree about what morality requires of us. And that was right. But that agreement is eroding, and it's certainly eroding by the time we get to someone like Mill. And that erosion, I think, accounts for the difference between Mill and Kant when it comes to what the purpose of moral philosophy is. So for Mill, the purpose of moral philosophy is to give us a test of right and wrong so we can figure out what's right and wrong. Right? That's Mill's idea. Last bit that I want to include from Mill's discussion here. Right? Okay, so Kant, he wrote this great work, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. He tries to give us one of these first principles of morality, tries to tell us what the fundamental principle is. It's this formula of universal law. Okay, fine. Continuing on with Mill now. But when he begins to deduce from this precept any of the actual duties of morality, he fails almost grotesquely to show that there would be any contradiction, any logical, not to say physical, impossibility in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. All he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur. What's he saying here? He's saying, a couple things. You can kind of break down what he's saying into two different things. First, one of the complaints that Mill is lodging here is that when Kant actually attempts to use the formula of universal law to derive specific moral obligations we have, Kant fails miserably. That's what Mill is saying, right? And so recall, what does Kant try to do? Kant tries to use his formula of universal law to derive a duty against lying, a duty against suicide, a moral obligation not to commit suicide, a moral obligation to develop your talents, and a moral obligation to help others when they are in need. Right? Kant attempts to use the formula of universal law to derive those four different duties. And one of the things we saw when we were looking at his derivations is that, yeah, okay, fine, maybe the lying one, that's kind of neat, that kind of works, but the other ones don't really seem to work that well. And some of them, especially when it comes to those derivations of duty, of imperfect duties, so develop your talents and help others when they're in need. I mean, Kant really is kind of dropping the ball there. That's Mill's idea. We saw that already, right? The second thing that Mill seems to be pointing at is that, this is a little bit more on the surface. Obviously, immoral behavior seems to pass Kant's test, pass the formula of universal law. So the example that we looked at in some detail was slapping the first person you see when you go out in public. That's obviously immoral. It's obviously an immoral rule of conduct, but it arguably passes the formula of universal law. And so what Mill is saying is that, Kant's fundamental principle doesn't really work. It doesn't give us an adequate criterion of right and wrong. And so, yeah, we have this rather impressive treatise from Kant, but it doesn't do what we need it to do. We're still lacking a clear articulation of the true fundamental principle of morality. And so Mill's going to attempt to give us that principle in chapter 2 of Utilitarianism.